Hi there. It's August the 11th, and we continue our progress through Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. We're in chapter 7, and we're reading from verses 1 to 24. There's a very important phrase at the beginning of this chapter which gives a clue as to what Paul is writing here. It says, "Concerning the things you wrote to me about." Now, unfortunately, we don't have the Corinthians letter to Paul, but we can kind of work out from hearing this end of the conversation on the phone what it is the Corinthians were saying. So the initial verse, N.T. Wright suggests that actually Paul is repeating back to the Corinthians what they've said to him when he says it's good for a man not to have sexual contact with a woman. That may be the case, or Paul is making a statement, but obviously it's in response to what they're saying. Yes, it is good for a man not to have sexual contact with a woman. Now, let's put ourselves in this Corinthian context again. We said already that Corinth was a really sexually incontinent city. It had a vast array of prostitutes who were serving the Aphrodite temple on the Acrocorinth. It was a port city. There were a lot of sailors there. In fact, the verb in Greek, Corinthian, meant to behave in a lewd and incontinent way, to Corinthize, we might say. So Corinth was actually known for its immoral behavior, and therefore it seems that what people in the church, some people in the church, are saying is, well, we should abstain from sex altogether. Sex is evil, sex is bad, something that perhaps some have made out in the church for a long time. But Paul is a Jew, and Jews have a very high regard for procreation. They have high regard for sexual intimacy and sexual relationship. It's something that is held in high esteem. So Paul is not about to agree with them. He says, actually, in fact, he says the opposite. He says, because there's so much immorality, it's not that you should abstain from sex and have no sex, but actually because of immorality, you should have covenanted relationship, which actually reflects the divine image, what he has built into creation. Remember that Paul is coming from a background that sees and understands God as the one who in himself, in his usness, has created man and woman, male and female, to have connection with each other. And therefore, in this context, he's saying men and women should come together, they should be in covenanted marriage, and actually they should satisfy one another's physical desires. They shouldn't keep themselves away from one another. Yes, there might be times when they abstain for different purposes, but let them come back together so that they're not tempted, so they're not tempted to have a look around and see what else is in the field. And this is a very important part of Paul's teaching. However, he does when he speaks to the unmarried people and the widows, and again it seems to be there's this law that's being laid down that no one should have sex. Paul is saying, okay, for those who are unmarried and those who are widows, yes, if you can stay like me, and that seems to indicate that Paul is either unmarried or widowed. We're not sure, he's not explicit about his own status, but he obviously isn't married at this point. And so he says, if you want to stay like me, that's fine. But if you're going to be struggling with immorality, if you're going to be struggling with sexual attraction, then be married. Live in this covenanted commitment that God has demonstrated, that God has sown into creation through family, and thereby glorify God. In fact, furthermore, he says, don't separate from unbelieving partners if they're willing to be with you. If you've become a believer and you have a partner who doesn't believe, you have a spouse who doesn't believe, don't leave them, because actually there's a sanctifying that goes on. God honors marriage, and therefore God will honor not just the partner but also the children of that marriage. However, he says, if that partner can't stand being with you, now you're a believer, let them go, because God isn't going to force you to remain in a relationship which is going to be unfruitful like that. And then he's talking about the overriding rule. There's a rule here that's basically saying, don't try and change your status in order to do stuff to please God. So he says here, if you're circumcised, don't try and be uncircumcised. If you're uncircumcised, don't go and get circumcised. This is not what the key thing is. He says what the key thing is following the instructions of God. And that doesn't mean doing little obediences to try and get yourself into God's good books. It means living God's way, living and following God. In the same way, he says, if you're a slave when you were called, don't try and struggle to be free. God already has you in his hands. If you get the chance of freedom, yes, be free. But the one who is called in the Lord is already a slave anyway and a freeman at the same time. Paul is basically saying our status, the true value of who we are, is found not in our human condition, not in whether we're married or single, not in whether we're slave or free, but actually is found in God, and we can live within that state. In fact, he says, you were bought with a price. You were bought with the Messiah's blood, therefore you belong to him. So let each person just be content in the place where they are. If you get the opportunity to change, let change come. But don't seek change as a way of pleasing God or trying to make yourself better in his sight. This is a very deep, very practical teaching that Paul is bringing here, both in terms of marriage and also in terms of how we find ourselves and trying to make ourselves different to please God. The glorious thing about this, God says, is he values you. You already are his. You belong to him. You're already enslaved, as it were, to his love. And you can't try and do anything to improve that. You won't make him love you more. You won't make him love you less. Have a very good August the 11th.